Welcome, Chosen X. You step into a courtyard that gathers in the morning like a promise laid out in stone. The building before you breathes with patient memory, its surfaces holding conversations that began before you learned how to listen. You did not arrive because someone opened a gate for you. You arrived because alignment moved you through corridors that remember footsteps of purpose. A hush forms from the inside of the place and it leans toward your rhythm. Light finds places where decisions have been kept and settles there with careful obligation. You approach an object at the center of a table. It is not merely an envelope. It is an intentional transmission crafted to ask rather than declare. It carries the shape of a commission more than a compliment. When you come near, the air around it does not simply warm. It asks for a posture. That asking changes the way you count time. Minutes begin to feel like stitches holding a fabric together. Actions rearrange their weight so that small movements draw the map of what will later be called a vocation. You discover that recognition can arrive as a call to labor and not as an applause. The difference is anatomical to interior life. It shifts how you stand, how you breathe, how you measure a pause. People nearby move in ways you do not need their permission to notice. Conversations lower and become thinner like threads that have been guided to meet. The room does not announce that it has been altered. It merely calibrates to a new standard. You become conscious of being a hinge rather than a landmark. Influence begins to behave like a responsibility. There is tenderness braided with the charge. Visibility gives resources and also generates trials that test the quality of your motives. Praise sometimes arrives wrapped in expectations that aim to bend your choices to public appetite. You learn quickly that applause can disguise a lever. The right response is not to avoid attention but to temper it with deliberate restraint. Your first nights are not full of triumph. They are full of waking with the sense of a promise that requires tending. You find that simple practices shape how the brightness within you holds. You choose to let gratitude anchor your mornings. You choose to convert public notice into private repair. You respond to new openings by building quiet systems of care where vanity cannot easily enter. This life develops under the patient rules of small acts. You forgive early because forgiveness preserves channels. You speak slowly because speech that travels unrefined can do harm. You give without marking the gift with a signature so that generosity refuses the currency of reputation. Those measures are small but they bind into a larger architecture of trust. There are tests that will not appear with headlines. Some trials come as offered privileges that wear the scent of ease. Others arrive as opportunities to rewrite tired scripts in relationships where you once failed. Each test reveals whether the glow that gathers around you is rooted in stewardship or in simple appetite for attention. You begin to notice that your presence changes the chemistry of rooms. Machines seem to move more smoothly. Conversations lose defensive edges. People that have been uneasy near power find themselves unbothered by your approach. That effect is not magic. It is a function of steadiness practiced in private. The world responds to constancy. As the first week passes, the envelope remains on the table where you first saw it. It does not demand to be open like a secret. It requires readiness. You realize the document was not a contract for control. It was an invitation to translate. Your task is not to reassign influence but to translate attention into repair. You understand that public recognition is a peculiar currency. It can purchase reach, but it cannot purchase integrity. Integrity is accrued in the hours where no one is watching. You learn to move in ways that protect your appetite for righteousness from the temptations of notoriety. You practice small disciplines that refuse to let praise become an idol. Night brings a different kind of education. Solitude becomes a training ground. In moments where the city lanterns blur into distant stars, you rehearse how to answer when pressure asks for compromise. You teach yourself to let the quiet shape your responses so that later, when choice becomes public, your motives feel familiar and unmoved by applause. A subtle camaraderie appears over time. Other people begin to show signs that they too carry a seriousness that cannot be manufactured. You watch them move with deliberate gentleness and you find in their gestures confirmations of a shared orientation. Together you form a network that does not require banners. It requires fidelity. The practice of fidelity changes how you sleep. You wake with a steady pulse that feels like a promise held between a maker and a steward. There is less hunger for spectacle and more hunger for integrity. That hunger reshapes the way you accept invitations, the way you respond to praise, and the way you let the world interpret your motives. You spend afternoons learning to make decisions that prioritize repair over headline industries of influence. You find satisfaction in the quiet correction of harm and annoyance in the noise that chases recognition. Over time, the content of your days aligns to a rhythm that privileges service over show. You begin to carry the weight of stewardship not as a burden but as a temperament. It becomes a habit of attention that colors even minor encounters. The blessing is that your presence begins to steady others. The cost is that your faults become more visible to yourself. That visibility requires humility as much as courage. On an evening when the sky is soft, your sense of calling deepens. The building that first received you becomes less an altar of arrival and more a reference point for the life you now choose. The envelope still rests at its center. You do not open it in spectacle. You sit with its implication and let the quiet sharpen what will be expected of you. You learn that being chosen is not an ending. It is an entrance into trust that must be earned every day. The first night in this new role concludes with a vow neither shouted nor announced but held like a steady flame within your chest. You rise toward the next day with an appointed steadiness that will become the work of your life. You accept the charge and awaken to steady work at dawn. You return to the city carrying the stillness that now attends you. Everyday routes respond with subtle courtesy. A crosswalk clears, a clerk straightens a list, a room leans towards sensible speech. Small details that once blurred into background become coordinates. Sounds sharpen and leave space for meaning to enter. Practical shifts appear first. Meetings shorten as people prefer truth to flourish over performance. Quiet gratitude slips into margins and creates room for mending where rivalry once widened faults. You begin to map where attention has been misspent and you move to reroute it toward repair rather than display. A weight settles with these choices. You find yourself invited into conversations you would once decline, not for drama but because the pressure at your chest demands clarity. Questions arise about who benefits from design policies and who bears hidden costs. Your role obliges you to interrogate leverage and protect fragile margins. Then a public test arrives. A high-profile initiative seeks your visible support. It promises immediate acclaim and prominent metrics but hides mechanisms that will widen existing inequalities. Your endorsement would catalyze funding and fanfare, refusal might stall progress and attract sharp criticism. You measure consequences differently now. Instead of trading visibility for reach, you gauge return by repair. You withhold your endorsement. The room tightens, some perceive timidity, others murmur thanks. Headlines call you obstructionist. Advisors press for quick decisions. The outrage machine heats up. The backlash is real, yet you remain. You spend weeks listening to people whose lives the program would shape. You trace where shortcuts fracture resilience and redesign protocols that redistribute access more equitably. The alternative plan moves slower and gains fewer immediate accolades, but promises durability. Slow work requires humility. You learn that steady tenderness is repetitive and often tedious. Repair is an ethic, an insistence on returning to small, broken places until they mend. You practice restraint as devotion. You refuse spectacle and prefer systems that limit harm and circulate care. Your nights become laboratories. You rehearse responses, refine choices, and catalog mistakes. The texture of each decision becomes a lesson. You cultivate colleagues who share temperament and discipline. Together you build safeguards that prevent vanity from corrupting intention. An unexpected crisis arrives. A sudden policy shift risks a vulnerable community. The brittle systems unravel. You mobilize the modest infrastructures you helped create. Teams you assembled move with explanation and speed. Aid reaches pockets that would have been overlooked. Walking later through streets touched by those efforts, you witness quiet shifts, a reopened storefront, children playing, a notice of extended hours. Gratitude comes in folded notes and private thanks, not press releases. These low-sun victories sustain you. Descent into responsibility has not diminished your influence, it has redefined it. Influence becomes a craft of repair rather than a platform for spectacle. The city hums with new patterns of care that hold under strain. You stand on a bridge at dusk, listening to water run underfoot, and you accept the slow, steady work as your rhythm. The campaign of visibility continues to pulse outside, but you choose the less glamorous path. Each refusal to perform preserves an integrity that eventually roots into community trust. The work goes on, and you walk that path with the patience of someone who knows that true transformation is built stitch by stitch. You deepen practices that protect the fragile trust placed in your hands. In gatherings you introduce questions that slow momentum so consequence can be seen. You fund discreet audits and ensure pilots invite those who will live with the results. Measures unseen by cameras become the bulwark of dignity. Temptation does not stop. Offers arrive with flattering language and promises of rapid reach. You respond with structures that diffuse power and invite accountability. Delegation takes time because it teaches and tests. That slowness produces resilience by spreading responsibility instead of hoarding it. Companions emerge who practice steady courage. They choose presence over performance. Together you adopt rituals that resist vanity, private reviews that center feedback, public hearings that lift seldom heard voices, accountability cycles that favor long-term repair above short-term applause. Loneliness will come. You accept it as the crucible where fidelity is clarified. In quiet rooms you rehearse answers to future tests and write reminders of why you began. Silence becomes a tool, not an absence. It shelters deliberation and helps you distinguish neglect from contemplation. Slow shifts begin to show. A clinic reopens, a program adjusts to be more accessible, a storefront that closed due to strain lights its sign again. These small returns are not coronations but proof that steady mending can alter daily life. You take these modest signs as confirmation that descent into care has reshaped influence into a craft of repair. You awake to a gravity in your chest that turns ordinary hours into missions. Morning light arranges errands into tasks with consequence. The city composes itself around your movements as if maps subtly redraw to include your steadiness. People who once spoke in surface phrases reveal edges of truth when you enter a room. Responsibility deepens and brings complexity. Problems you meet have histories and faces beyond summaries. Solving them requires patience paired with precision. You prefer questions that unearth context to answers that decorate opinion. Where methods favored speed and spectacle, you cultivate endurance and fidelity. A crisis appears outside headlines. A network fractures because someone chose efficiency over dignity. Shortcuts hollowed safety nets and you feel the pull to repair. The choice is stark and layered, to rally for visibility that soothes optics or to invest in mending that yields lasting dignity. You gather practitioners who value craft over applause. Their faces are ordinary and their resolve is quiet. Together you study processes and trace flows not as boxes but as living circuits. You refuse easy fixes. You design interventions that slow momentum just enough to let voices surface that haste had smoothed away. The work tests temper. Short-term praise and pressure gnaw at resolve. Allies urge swift endorsement to quell critics. Opponents weaponize delay. You hold the line, explaining with measured language how durable systems require oversight and community feedback. You do not grandstand. Your explanations are plain and tied to dignity. Bureaucracy resists. Meetings can become traps for performance. You turn committees into listening rooms. Every proposal must include testimony from those affected. Trial runs prioritize equitable access. The adjustments you make are small in description and profound in effect. Failures occur. A pilot falters because a partner failed to consult neighbors. You accept responsibility and reconfigure the plan with new stakeholders. People bring inconvenient truths instead of flattering reports. They speak of gaps with language sharpened by safety, not shame. Months pass and initiatives show durability. Transit adjusts to irregular shifts. Clinics extend hours after you reveal missed appointment data. Local shops report steadier traffic after barriers are negotiated. The changes are modest but resilient. You feel sorrow and joy. Repair requires naming harm. You sit with elders who recall patterns of neglect. You listen to parents who describe children left out by systems designed for convenience. These testimonies anchor you more than statistics. They become the liturgy that guides design. Temptation persists. Grants arrive with strings that skew priorities toward spectacle. Funders promise visibility for metrics that favor short-term wins. You respond with transparency measures and insist funds follow local needs. Negotiations proceed without fanfare, focused on contractual clarity and community governance. Your nights fill with reading and rest practiced as discipline. Small rituals restore perspective, a walk through a quiet park, notes to colleagues that name unseen labor, and check-ins with mentors who weathered similar storms. These habits sustain resilience. The community adopts your orientation. Leaders from neighboring districts ask how you sustain momentum. You share blueprints and introduce accountability routines. You teach teams to measure dignity into their indicators. Your role shifts from commanding to capacitating. Skeptics remain. Some prefer charismatic displays that promise rapid transformation. You do not seek conversion. You deliver results that resist headlines but persist in daily life. Over time, visible metrics are complemented by signs of stability, fewer emergencies, rising trust, and more equitable access. In quiet interlude, you return to the room of your initial commission and find its symbol unchanged yet more meaningful. The object you first perceived as ceremony now feels like a ledger of fidelity. You touch it not as a talisman but to acknowledge a covenant. Your fingers sense cool responsibility, and in that contact you renew vows of service. The revelation is not triumphant but calibrating. Power entrusted to you demands attention to mundane details that aggregate into justice. Your identity reshapes around capacity to bear complexity without losing tenderness. You continue, knowing each small structural repair is a prophecy fulfilled in human terms. The work is not glamorous, but it alters lives. You accept that legacy will be held in systems that outlast headlines and communities that hold less fear. When the day ends, you catalog choices that honor people even at cost to acclaim. You breathe, aware endurance is the truest test. The city hums beyond your window, threaded with steadier rhythms. You close your notepad and rise, prepare for challenges that will ask the same quiet courage you practiced. You stand at a threshold where insight and consequence meet and refuse to be separated. Morning arrives with a firmness that feels like exam and benediction at once. You are no longer only an instrument of attention. You have become a bearer of consequence whose decisions will echo in the routines of people you may never meet. A revelation unfolds not as spectacle but as an internal architecture. Structure emerges from questions you ask rather than proclamations you make. Where you once admired scale, you now prize coherence. The truth you inherit insists on mapping systems that do not betray trust when pressure arrives. That insistence is quiet and unyielding. You remember faces. Not the famous, but those who taught patience through small grievances and steady courage. Their stories teach you that repair requires humility and the courage to remain accountable to ordinary lives. You honor them by reshaping targets and setting goals that protect dignity rather than inflate visibility. Clarity sharpens into mandate. The object you once regarded as symbolic now contains directives of subtlety and range. It calls for attention to processes that channel resources precisely where need and potential align. You read the mandate as if listening to an old instrument recalibrated for new resonance. Resistance appears in manners both polite and cunning. Some argue for speed and applause. Others offer collaborations wrapped in metrics designed to please cameras. You assess each proposal through a lens polished by experience. When something promises attention without repair, you decline. When something sacrifices time to build trust, you commit. The cost of fidelity becomes evident in moments of isolation. You discover that carrying responsibility can shrink social warmth because people expect performance or become suspicious of restraint. You accept these tensions as the price of coherence. If you must be misunderstood for a season, you will accept it rather than exchange purpose for comfort. Within governance there is also poetry. Protocols become rituals of care when practiced with intention. Convenings evolve into listening spaces. Agendas become invitations to participation rather than platforms for pronouncement. When you choose language that invites testimony, people respond with courage and clarity. You learn to treat power as a matter that must be tended. It requires temperature control, moderation, and distribution. You practice dispersing authority by creating openings for others to lead, ensuring that decisions are not concentrated in a single chest. That distribution becomes a safeguard against vanity and a means of cultivating resilience. And inner weather shifts. Moments of doubt arrive and you meet them with practices that have nothing to do with optics. You return to reading, to private counsel, to small acts of service that reconnect intention to action. These routines are your grounding. They keep the essence of your mission from fraying when praise or pressure tries to reweave it into something foreign. A defining hour comes when an urgent test arrives. A coalition asks you to endorse a plan that would accelerate resource flows but would exclude marginal participants for the sake of expedience. The plan would look impressive on paper and perform well on television. You hold away from the applause and insist on amendment. The negotiation is painful and slow. Some partners withdraw. Others adapt. In the end, the amended plan moves more slowly but reaches more people. That decision costs you public favor in some corners and wins trust in others. You weigh those outcomes not by applause but by whether harm was reduced and dignity preserved. The choice reaffirms that stewardship will always require choosing the longer arc over the quick gain. A new level of interconnectedness appears. Other stewards surface in different places and offer collaboration shaped by the same principles. A network formed that values maintenance over show. You exchange strategies quietly and coordinate efforts so that when crises occur, responses are steady instead of sensational. Your voice changes. It no longer seeks to fill space. It aims to clear space for testimony, to create a grammar of repair that others can use without your presence. That grammar becomes a manual of practice for teams and communities who need durable patterns more than charismatic guidance. Evening practice becomes central. You close the day by recalling choices that preserve human dignity and by listing where you will focus patience tomorrow. This ritual is not public. You keep it private as a means of resisting the performance loop that often disguises itself as leadership. You encounter moments of grace that confirm the path. A child laughs in a place that was once quiet, businesses sustain longer hours, caregivers return to work because systems now accommodate their rhythm. These are small confirmations, but they are the measures that matters. They indicate that your work translates into lived safety and possibility. Yet vigilance remains necessary. Temptations arrive as flattering requests and flattering platforms. You meet them with steady protocols that require transparency, community sign-off, and specific metrics tied to dignity. Your judgment grows sharper. It learns to distinguish spectacle from substance quickly. A quiet communion grows with those who share the load. You organize around practices that keep you honest and accountable. You mentor new leaders to adopt measures of repair and to avoid the allure of immediate renown. You focus on teaching steadiness and the craft of careful administration. The revelation you carry demands translation. It asks you to convert insight into structures that persist when you are absent. You design those structures with the help of communities who live inside the systems you aim to improve. Co-creation becomes a rule, not an afterthought. In the deep of night you sometimes encounter a tender sorrow that accompanies responsibility. It is not regret but the weight of seeing harm and insisting on the hard work of mending it. That sorrow is a companion that sharpens compassion and prevents complacency. You do not see the labor completed in your lifetime. You trust that the scaffolding of practice you build will outlast headlines and sustain future stewards. This trust is the essence of your vocation. It allows you to choose patience over applause repeatedly. At dawn you stand again in the room where everything shifted. The object of your commission sits as before, unchanged in form but fuller in meaning. You touch it to recall vows and to remember that revelation is less about arrival and more about continual translation into deeds that endure. You rise and step into the day with a clarity that binds thought to action. The revelation you received is now a series of living arrangements designed to protect dignity and expand possibility. Your work continues with the quiet insistence of someone who knows that justice is made by steady hands and faithful repetition. You choose patience and build frameworks that outlast acclaim, ever. You enter the final arc with hands formed by practice and a mind trained in restraint. Mornings feel like deliberations, not announcements. The world taught you that steady tending solves more than spectacle ever could. You move now with an economy of motion, each choice measured by whether it enlarges dignity and reduces needless exposure. Problems arrive like layered weather. They are woven with history and habit, and your work is to untangle without tearing. You set priorities that honor people more than statistics. Where haste once promised applause, patience secures durable access. You design processes that resist collapse by sharing authority and inviting local knowledge into decisions. Temptations persist. Platforms promise shortcuts that glitter under cameras. You evaluate offers by asking who will shoulder the consequences and whether benefits reach those who bear the cost. You decline deals that trade depth for speed and insist on structures that embed feedback and oversight. Your companions are craftsmen of service whose profiles are measured in time and fidelity rather than fame. Together you create forums where those most affected speak first and establish review rituals that preserve humility. Accountability becomes a craft rather than theater. Solitude becomes rehearsal. You return to disciplines with no audience, careful reading, handwritten notes, and walks that untangle thought. These acts are not grand but they have a steady direction. A maturing revelation asserts itself. Power that persists must be administered so it does not concentrate in a single palm. You practice distributing authority so systems function when you are absent. That diffusion multiplies capacity and limits corruption. Crisis will test the seams. A sudden shortage or a collapsed partner reveals weak links. You convene affected people, map failures, and repair networks. Your responses are slow enough to be thorough and swift enough to prevent collapse. The press misses these repairs, but communities notice. Modest wins accumulate. Clinics keep hours that fit caregivers. Transit holds its routes. Schools report fewer interruptions. These are not headlines, yet they steady daily life. You learn to read the texture of ordinary days as the primary metric. Words change in your mouth. You speak to invite testimony and instruct practice. Rhetoric yields to manuals and templates. Language becomes a tool for teaching rather than claiming credit. You build redundancy. When one node fails, others carry load. You favor durable mechanisms over theatrical gestures. This engineering of civic life is invisible but yields visible peace. Costs accrue. Grand stages require decline. Some friendships strain. Critics misread slowness as hesitancy. You accept misinterpretation when reduced harm and increased capacity for care are the balance. A network of stewards appears. They trade blueprints, not slogans. This diffuse assembly values continuity over applause. When pressure spikes, redundancy keeps systems alive. A public moment arrives. A program seeks your endorsement on camera. You require amendments that embed local governance and accountability. Negotiations are tense. Some partners leave. The revised plan proceeds with oversight and broader participation. The public story is mixed, but the implementation honors those who live with its consequences. You learn that shared authority expands repair. Leadership practiced as enabling outperforms centered command. You become a node in a grid rather than an axis. Each night you catalog mistakes and celebrate hidden victories. You renew vows to humility and attention. These private rituals resist the performance loop that often cloaks leadership. Mentoring becomes central. You teach new stewards to design with patience and to resist spectacle. You share failures as openly as successes so that the next cohort learns both. Finally, you return to the place where the first transmission began. The object that once marked appointment now reads as a ledger of faithful choices. You rest your palm on it to remember obligations written in daily deeds. A screen brightens with footage that continues this labor in living form. The film is intimate and practical. It shows neighbors redesigning systems, practitioners facilitating listening sessions, and templates that translate ideas into action. You are invited to watch because viewing is a form of training. The footage teaches posture, shares templates, and models how to hold power with humility. Watching is an active step into practice. If you intend to stay engaged, press play. If you plan to help sustain the next steps, subscribe and enable notifications so each new transmission arrives in time for practice. This invitation is not about following a personality but joining a craft. The next chapter continues in the frame ahead, and your attention completes the passage. Be present as an apprentice, the work deepens with your careful presence now.